in how the book of the 12 is written. Haggai acts like a time hop. Last week, at the end of Zephaniah, Babylon was threatening to take over Jerusalem at the turn of the 6th century. Well, eventually, Babylon does just that. In 587, before Christ came into the world, Jerusalem was sacked by Babylon. Everyone was sent into what we know as the exile. If you read 2 Chronicles 36 sometime, you'll see how destructive Babylon was. It's graphic and brutal. For the next 50 years, Jerusalem is a wasteland. But then, a time hop. Enter the Persians. They were led by Cyrus the Great. In 539 BCE, they defeat the Babylonians, and they gain control over the entire Babylonian Empire, which would be present-day Iran and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Israel. When Cyrus became king, he notices there is a bunch of Judeans scattered all across the world. And there is also a major trade city sitting vacant. In his mind, allowing all of the Jews to return back to Jerusalem as an occupied people, that would be better for his empire than all of them being in exile. So in a remarkable moment in history, Cyrus issues an edict that all of the Jews would be allowed to return home and to rebuild their city. 2 Chronicles 36:23 is that historical edict. Now this matters in understanding Haggai, because Haggai's context is the Persian control. The Jews have returned home from exile, and now they are in the process of rebuilding their city. If you ever read Ezra or Nehemiah, that's what you're reading. They're rebuilding Jerusalem after 50 years of exile. Now, it is easy to romanticize the next few decades of Israel's history. Oftentimes we think, well, they got home from exile and everything went perfectly. Persia was perfectly nice. The Judeans reconnected with God in a perfectly holy way, and they became the voice of a perfectly spiritual renewal for all of the other countries in the world. That is not at all what happens. Think about how hard it would be to rebuild a burnt city after it has been sit vacant for 50 years. The personnel that the Jewish community had was low. The morale, low. Resources, low. Leadership, spotty at best. When you read Nehemiah, you learn that Persia doesn't have a stronghold over all the people groups and tribes in the world either. There are tribes that are still trying to fight and attack for Jerusalem's land. Nehemiah helps us here. We learn that the Jews had to build their walls of the city with blocks in one hand and a sword in the other. The conditions for the Jews are tough. Resources are low. None of this sparks joy for wanting to jump in and rebuild the city. But Haggai knew if they could just rebuild the temple, then morale would go up. People's lives would be centered and grounded again. The temple would remind people that there is a spiritual presence in the world. There is transcendent mystery that we can engage in. And when people come to worship in a shared space, they experience that mystery. But despite Haggai's attempts, as well as other leaders like Zerubbabel and Joshua, they tried to encourage the people to rebuild the temple. But that's not what the people do. They do go back to Jerusalem, but they turn their attention onto their own homes. They build their own barns. They focus on their own needs. They work their own land, and they take care of their own family. the effort to rebuild a shared space for community so that community could meet God, it was not a high priority. Although the context is drastically different, I think that we're seeing in 2019 the same attitude manifesting itself about church culture today. Mainline Protestant churches are shrinking. The Catholic Church in America, shrinking. Culture is shifting. Weekly church attendance is less a priority. And there are all kinds of reasons for this. When I was on sabbatical, I read a great deal of research over the shift in faith formation due to the shift in American Protestantism, due to the shift in American culture. And I am prepared to share a ton of the stuff that I have researched, especially on Wednesday nights throughout this fall. What I will tell you now is there is a ton of people who can identify the problem. There's no one who has the answer. But we can name the problem. The problem is this. People, rightfully so, are no longer loyal to institutions for the sake of loyalty. One of the books that I read on sabbatical says that don't focus on church, focus on the larger cultural shifts in our American history. Church is a byproduct of something bigger that's happening. His argument's compelling. In the 50s and the 60s, young adults started to critique and stopped trusting institutions. Who was a teenager in the 50s and 60s? I'm talking squarely to you. You started to recover from World War II, which was terrible. It has taken you the majority of your early years to try to build something that didn't resemble Hitler. The Cold War was right in your midst. It was long and it was hard. Vietnam happened while you were teenagers. We were lied to about Vietnam. The civil rights movement emerged in the 60s. We were lied to about how people should engage with one another in society. Each one of these movements and moments and wars created distrust with the bedrock of our loyalty to institutions, especially institutions like the government. Do you remember the game show, $64,000 Question? Now, young adults will not remember this game show. I was not even alive when it came out. But apparently, America found out that one of their beloved nationally televised game shows were feeding contestants the answers. Do y'all remember this? It put a shockwave across America that you can't trust the system that's in place. Institutions, government in the 60s suffered massive amounts of distrust with culture. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. Nixon was president in 1969. Woodstock became a thing summer of 69. Why do you think there was so much conspiracy about whether or not we actually landed on the moon or didn't? We landed on the moon in 1969. Critiquing government, critiquing corporate jobs, critiquing school curriculum became the norm. Also, critiquing church did too. Nothing was automatically given our loyalty. We had to start earning our trust. The flower power generation created a new way to live. And that way, it really is still blooming today. You have birthed a generation, my generation, that has the same attitude. We're not going to be dutiful for the sake of being dutiful. You have to earn our trust. Every generation since the baby boomers is living with this ability to critique. Now, this is interesting. Liberal arts education all across America at this point in the 60s boomed. People started studying philosophy and sociology and human development like psychology. You didn't just go to college to get an MD or to study engineering to go work for a major corporation because that was your sense of duty. The learning at higher education shifted. Now we're focusing on culture and we're being taught criticisms on how to study them. And that's a good thing. Church should be critiqued. Lord knows both the Protestant church and the Catholic church in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we have manipulated and abused and oppressed far too many people. Now, I have often said you don't have to know you're oppressed to be oppressed. And that is definitely true for what the church has done to people. The church is guilty of forcing and coercing oppression onto people. The church has manipulated and abused and failed to meet families. They have failed to meet the underserved or the homeless. They have failed to meet women. They have failed to meet people who identify with the LGBT. There, time and time again, we have failed to meet the community in a time of need. The church instead used scare tactics, aligned itself wrongfully with political parties, and ultimately the church lost an entire generation's loyalty. Now, I could speak for hours about more of this, especially how the madmen of the advertising world in the 60s and 70s learned how to capitalize on this new trend to push against institutionalism and to create this path or attitude towards authenticity. But that has nothing to do with Haggai. My purpose in telling you all of this is to simply say now what we're experiencing in church culture in 2019 is not the fault of millennials. That's what I want you to know. It's not my fault. It's much deeper than that. It's evident, and the research is plentiful. There is a cultural shift occurring in organized religion. People in this country give less time and less money to organized religion. This is not new. It's been going on for 70 years, and it mirrors what was going on 500 years before Jesus. When culture experiences a shift of this magnitude, what ends up getting hit the worst are the faith development resources that the church can offer. When you think about lack of church attendance, causes a trickle-down effect to smaller budgets, which causes churches to stop offering as many programs, which eliminates the need for leadership development because you don't have programs for people to lead, which creates a stopgap for offering new leadership opportunities to the next generation, which leads to the death of programs due to the lack of resources and support without anything prepared to emerge in its place. This puts a strain on ministers, and it squashes a church's vision. Do you know over 90% of organized religion and Christian churches are less than 100 people? Over 90% of churches in America have less than 100 members. Churches can't sustain purchasing resources for people who don't show up. So most churches stop purchasing resources, which stops educating a community on the need for spiritual, transcendent mystery, which Haggai will tell you that is the beginning of the death pangs of a community. The American church is in a tough spot. And what I'm seeing as we in America are currently mirroring Judah's apathy that we see in Haggai. Haggai 1. I'm going to start in verse 4. Is it time for you yourselves to live in paneled houses while the Lord's house lies in ruins? Now therefore, says the Lord of hosts, consider how you have fared. You have sown much, but you harvest little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you're never filled. You clothe yourself, but you're never warm. And you that earn wages to put them into bags of holes. That is a big statement. Haggai is calling out the insular focus of the Jews. Because Haggai knows that when you enter life, when your entire life is dedicated to your own space, or your own needs, or your own land, or your own time, then you cease to become a community. A community has to have some level of outpouring and shared space with one another. So the notion of rebuilding the temple is a brave attempt at reminding the people in Israel that there is a spiritual transcendent mystery in this world. And the temple can stand as a reminder that life is not just about what's happening on our farms, but rather it's about how we can share in life and community together. So that's what Haggai's entire prophecy is about. It's how Judah must start focusing on a shared spiritual space and less on their own homes, which leads to the text I read earlier. Haggai asks that priests answer a question for him. He has two questions. This is chapter 2, verse 11. Thus says the Lord of hosts, ask the priests for a ruling. If one carries consecrated meat in the fold of one's garment, and then that fold touches bread or stew or wine or oil or any other kind of food, does that food become holy? When the priest answered, no, that's not how consecration works. That's not how holiness works. No, you don't. The new bread would not be holy. Well, then Haggai said, well, what if you are carrying all this food and you accidentally touch a dead body? Does the food then also become unclean? Well, the priest said, yes, that's exactly how holiness and cleanliness works. If you touch a dead body, you are now unclean. So, yes. So then verse 14 is the kicker. Haggai then said, well, so it is true with you people and with this whole nation, and so with every work of their hands. Everything that you're doing is now unclean. Haggai is telling the Jews that their efforts to rebuild their city without a temple is like touching a dead body. There is no shared space for spiritual transcendent mystery for them. And this is a real problem for God. So what's Haggai's solution? You build a temple. You create shared space for spirituality to exist. You see the financial responsibility of crafting a space for transcendent mystery. Haggai knows that if they could do it, it will change culture. If they can raise morale, then it will change culture. It will offer insight into God and otherwise that they would get from their day to day. And here's how the prophecy of Haggai speaks to us today. We have to be a people who see a need for a spiritual transcendent mystery. First Baptist is perfectly suited for this kind of presence in Waynesboro. We've been doing it for 144 years, and we could do it for another. And for the last 4 years that I've been here, I feel like we're doing a great job at this. But we need people like you to continue to see the vision in it. As ministers, we're working hard to create space for your family to engage in a spiritual transcendent mystery. That's a good way to describe what we do every day. And we have to be very fluid at this. Now, you'll see over the next year a dynamic attempt to digitize resources for everyone in this community. We've already started, but we're going to continue offering Bible studies and media and resources and conversations and podcasts and sermons and try to digitize them to meet you where you are. We know your lives are busy. We know you're not going to show up every single Sunday just because the doors are open. We have to create some other way to get your loyalty. We have to find a way for you to enjoy and to want and to desire to experience shared transcendence, to experience mystery when we're together. And we know you're busy, so we're going to continue to help meet you where you are. And we want to help meet your kids where they are too. And I know you know, and now you know that Haggai knows that we need spaces that help us slow down, that don't make us speed up. We need spaces to reflect. We need spaces to experience mystery together. This can happen online, and it can happen when we come together for corporate worship. And this was Haggai's big claim for the New Jerusalem, that if you create a shared space, you'll experience the mysteries of God. He demanded that Judah must give of their resources, both their time and their tithes, to build the temple. That was how it was going to be if they were going to make it happen. Everybody had to give to that vision. That message is crazy relevant today. So we're going to do a lot over the next several years. We're already starting to do stuff online. I've talked about and put it into soundings. There'll be a ton more information, but we're going to create an online book club to engage people in discussions of theology. We're going to share a ton more data through our website, which is already very good. But we need you to see a need in this. We need you to participate, but not out of a sense of duty. I am done with duty. I don't have any desire for you to show up just because the doors are open. That is not what the new shift in American culture is inviting us into. Instead, I want you to believe that First Baptist has the ability to meet you where you need to be met spiritually. And then it invites you into shared transcendence and mystery together. And it also invites your friends and family too. I think what Haggai is asking of the Jews is exactly what God is asking of us today. We have to give our time and tithes to the spiritual life of a community. And when we do, it's game-changing for the community. It awakens the consciousness of others to mystery. And it should be our driving force for why we give and participate in church, not duty. And so when we give to First Baptist, we're inviting adults and kids into a created shared space that engages God. So for me, Haggai is very relevant today. We have the same apathy, not you, but culture in America, towards institutions that we see the Jews did. But we can break that. We can start trusting church again if we learn that its effort is not to indoctrinate. The church's effort is not to manipulate. The church's effort is definitely not to abuse, but rather to create a shared space for mystery, for transcendence, for God.